So that's it for application level denial of service. Here are some possible defenses. One thing you have to do is identify that the denial of service attack is going on. This goes all the way back to our security principles, where we said there was a difference between detection and prevention and all that stuff. So here, we have to make sure we are able to detect that the attack is going on before we can defend against it or prevent it or mitigate it. So the first thing you need to do is notice that someone is trying to attack you, and that might be easier said than done. Somehow you have to know that this user is being malicious and sending you inputs to exhaust your resources or try and crash your program, whereas this user is being legitimate. How to do that depends on your application and may or may not be so easy. How do you know if the input is malicious or legitimate? Might not be so clear. One way to maybe help identification is to identify which users are sending you inputs. So if you're building a service, but there's no login and anybody can send you requests, then it might be hard to figure out who's an attacker and who's not, because there is no login mechanism. Everyone's just sending you whatever input they want. But maybe if you have some sort of login mechanism and you force all the users to log in before they use your sorting service or whatever service it is you're offering, maybe you can use that login information to notice that this specific user is being malicious and this user is not. So that could be one way to help you identify what users are attackers. But if you introduce authentication, you have to be careful that authentication itself isn't vulnerable to denial of service. So if you're using a really slow password hashing algorithm or something, you want to make sure someone cannot spam that algorithm and exhaust all of your resources. That might be something you have to solve with a timeout or something. So even the authentication process has limited resources and has to be defended against denial of service. So that's how you identify that the attack is happening. Once you know that denial of service is happening, what are some ways to stop it or prevent it? One thing you can do is try and isolate users from each other. So make sure that one user's actions don't affect what other users are seeing. If one user is somehow able to crash your system and that affects all of the other users, that might be bad system design on your part, the part of the server. So maybe you want to run the user's query in some sort of sandbox so that if they crash their own sandbox, other users are still able to access your service. Those might be examples of how to isolate users between each other so that one user who's malicious cannot ruin the experience for everyone else. Now, what about resource exhaustion? Maybe one way to solve that is to enforce quotas and say that each user is limited to a certain amount of resources that you have. So if you have limited resources, you can tell every user that they're only allowed to use, for example, 4 gigabytes of RAM on any given day. And if they try to request more than that, then your system can say no and deny them the additional resources. That might be one way to solve or prevent denial of service. Or maybe you ask users to authenticate themselves further. Maybe they have to prove that they're trustworthy somehow. Maybe they have to pay you money, or they have to somehow, I don't know, show that they're trustworthy. And only after they verify their trust do you let them execute your more expensive requests. So maybe everyone can do the cheap requests, but for the very high intensity, expensive requests, you need the users to do an extra step, like verifying a phone number or paying you some amount of money. So those might be ways to stop application level denial of service attacks. Here are some other possible defenses. Another possible defense is called proof of work. And here the idea is to make life a little bit harder for the attacker as well. So instead of letting the users request things basically for free, for example, in your sorting service, any user can just give you any sequence of numbers and you have to sort it for them. This makes it very easy for attackers to try and overwhelm your resources. They don't have to do a lot of work, but you have to do all the hard work of sorting. So one thing you can do is make the users life a little bit harder by making them do a little bit more work before they're allowed to issue a request. So for example, maybe you add a CAPTCHA, and now the user has to do just a little bit of extra work, like solving a CAPTCHA or paying someone else to solve it, before you will execute their request. So now you're making the user do a little bit more work, and this levels the playing field a little bit. So instead of the attacker doing something very cheap and causing the server to do something very expensive, now the attacker's job is a little bit more expensive as well. So that's one possible defense. And there's always the most obvious defense, which is just to go buy more resources. So if resources are limited, then go get more, and maybe that will help you defend against some denial of service attacks. Now, security is economics, so you can't just do this for free. If you want more resources to stop denial of service attacks, it can cost you money, but if you have a lot of resources, you can make it very hard for attackers to overwhelm your service. And there's actually services out there that over-provision for you. So there is something out there called a content delivery network, and I think of it like an insurance scheme. So does everyone know how insurance works in real life? What happens is everyone here pays a little bit of money to the insurance company for safety. Then the insurance company pools all of our money, and if any of us needs the money because we get sick or something, then the insurance will pay out more money to us because we're the ones that need it. So that's a quick refresher for how insurance works. And a content delivery network is basically insurance, but for servers. So maybe all of us have little startup websites that we're running, and none of us can afford to buy an enormous server because those are expensive. So maybe what all of us can do is we can pool all of our resources together. All of us chip in a little bit of money. So you chip in $10, I chip in $10. We get a big pool of money together, and we go and buy the biggest server we could possibly buy using our pooled resources. That's a stronger server than any one of us could have bought, but we pool our services together and buy this enormous, powerful server. Then we can all run our services using that powerful server. And if someone is running a denial of service attack, then we have that powerful server to try and defend against that attack because it has an enormous amount of resources. So that's kind of an analogy for how something like a CDN might work. And there's actually companies out there that do this for a living. So they run and maintain really big servers. And for a little bit of money, you can run your service on their enormous servers. And they would offer denial of service protection. And these services work because lots of users buy into the insurance scheme. All of us are pooling our money so that Cloudflare can afford to run and maintain those enormous servers for us. So that's one final defense against application level denial of service.